right, welcome, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's virtual event from Majors and Quinn Booksellers. My name is Matthew, and I am an events operator as well as a bookseller here at the store. For those who don't know, Majors and Quinn is an independent bookseller based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If it is your first time viewing one of our events, we're happy to have you. Welcome. And if it's not your first time, welcome back. We appreciate any and all continued support of ourselves and our events programs. This evening, we are thrilled to have our guest author, Cameron Hewitt, here with his book, The Temporary European. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of The Temporary European, you can head to our website, majorsandquinn.com. But I will also be putting a link directly into the comments of the video feed in just a few moments once we get started. And speaking of the comments, please feel free to talk to us and post any questions, comments, whatever you have. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Any and all, we're happy to take it. And we will be taking some questions in the end and asking Cameron specifically. And whenever those pop up, please feel free to post them. And we'll get to as many of them as we can. So now, let me introduce tonight's guest author, Cameron Hewitt. Cameron is a travel writer and photographer based in Seattle, USA. Since 2000, he has worked at Rick Steves Europe Incorporated, a guidebook publisher, public television and radio producer, and tour operator based in Edmonds, Washington. Since 2001, he has spent about 100 days each year in Europe. Most of his time is devoted to researching, updating, and writing new material for guidebooks. He co-authors guidebooks on Eastern Europe, Croatia, and Slovenia, and Budapest. While he started his career with a focus on Eastern and Central Europe, he soon pivoted to become a generalist. At one time or another, he has updated or contributed to virtually every Rick Steves guidebook title. He was a major contributor and or project manager for the books on Iceland, Scotland, Greece, Switzerland, Belgium, Berlin, Istanbul, various phrase books, an upcoming book about Italian food, and books on cruising both in the Mediterranean and Scandinavia and Northern Europe. So please, everyone, welcome me in joining tonight's guest author, Cameron Hewitt.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew, for having me. And thank you to Majors and Quinn for inviting me here tonight. I was telling our hosts, I've been on a book tour since the book came out this spring. This is my first virtual one. It's also the first time I'm using slides, so I'm kind of excited to do that. And I'm really excited today to talk to you about my new book. I did all those projects through the Rick Steves Company, which has been great fun, continues to be great fun. But today I'm talking about my own travel memoir, The Temporary European. And Matthew, if you want to turn on the slides, I can tell you a little bit about what we're going to be talking about here today and what I do with Rick Steves. I actually moved out from Ohio, where I grew up, not that far from where you are all in Minneapolis. Moved out to Seattle in the spring of 2000 to work with Rick Steves, and I have been working there ever since, and I really love collaborating with Rick. I spend about 100 days in Europe every year, doing a lot of different tasks. Mostly, I'm working on our travel guidebook updates. I also am a tour guide, and I'm also help out sometimes with the television production. So I, for example, just got back a few weeks ago, about 6 weeks ago. I got back from about a 50-day trip updating our guidebooks all over Europe, ending with a few weeks in Scotland, which keeps me plenty busy. But of course, during the pandemic, travel was grounded. We couldn't go anywhere. And a lot of us were stuck at home. So that starting in March of 2000, like a lot of people, I found myself working from my dining room table. And I realized pretty quickly that someone who's used to traveling as much as I was, 100 days a year in Europe, was going to have a pretty long, slow, boring period through the pandemic. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to take, things were really quiet at Rick Steves Europe, obviously, because we couldn't run our tours and we couldn't update our books. So I said, I'm going to take a sabbatical. And I'm going to go back through all of these blog posts that I'd been writing on the Rick Steves website. I have a blog there that I still keep regularly. And I had several years worth of unpublished blog posts and other unpublished writings. And I decided I'm going to sit down and just basically spend those 2 years, what turned out to be 2 years of the pandemic, reliving all of my travels, going all the way back to when I first went to Europe when I was in college, and continuing all the way through to 2019 when we all got grounded for a little while. And it was an interesting project because at first I thought I have all these sort of disparate stories that don't necessarily tie together too well. But when I started to work on them and kind of refine them and rewrite them, I realized they all very much were united by a common theme. And the theme became the title of this book, which is The Temporary European. So that's going to be our theme tonight. And what do I mean by the temporary European? When I think of the temporary European, that means to me two things. It's traveling with curiosity and it's traveling with empathy. It's really trying to understand why people do things the way they do in other parts of the world and trying to understand why, hopefully with a sense of kind of curiosity and acceptance. Here's how I describe it. I'm going to read several excerpts tonight. So I'm going to start by reading an excerpt of how I describe the idea of the temporary European in the introduction of my book. A temporary European is empathetic. They assume that other people's ways make sense to them, and they try to understand why. If you barge into a French shop without saying, "Bonjour, madame," and find the shopkeeper unfriendly, imagine how you'd feel if someone did the same in your living room. If you're in Croatia and people are cranky, trust them when they explain that the muggy Yugo wind puts everyone in a foul mood. If Germans are standing in the pouring rain with not a car in sight, waiting for the light to change, wait with them while contemplating why rule following is important to their notion of a successful society. And if an Italian barista grows agitated when you order a cappuccino after lunchtime, consider how having so much milk late in the day might actually be bad for your digestion. We're primed by both nature and culture to impose our preconceptions on anything new. Even for experts, it requires concerted effort to fight those twinges of judgment and travel with curiosity. It's simple in concept, but difficult in execution. I have many examples of being a temporary European in my book, but one that in each case, it's not just sort of identifying cultural characteristics and traditions, but really trying to sort of maybe psychoanalyze them a little bit, try to understand why people do things the way they do. And I think part of that is also trying on different traditions for size and seeing how they fit. And I think a lot of us travelers find that as we travel around, we try different things and we realize maybe we actually like the logic behind some of the ways that other people do things. Rick Steves describes this as being a cultural chameleon, which I think is a great turn of phrase. So for example, Matthew, if you could turn on the slides again, I want to talk about one example of this, which is how people get their caffeine. Okay, so not everyone, but most people have some ritual for getting their caffeine fix every day. In my case, it's an afternoon thing every day around the same time, about an hour after lunch. I get up from my desk, whether I'm here at home or at my office in Edmonds, Washington, and I walk to the nearest coffee shop, and they know my order. When I walk in the door, before I say anything, they know what I'm going to have. And I get a takeout latte, and then I sort of sip it on my way back to the desk. And usually by the time I get back to my office, it's gone. It's that's sort of the way I do it. It's a very soothing routine, and it kind of keeps me going. When you travel, you realize a lot of other people have their own routines, and they could be kind of fun to try out. So for example, if you're in Italy and in some parts of France, rather than get a takeout coffee, people like to stand at a long marble counter and they kind of take a little tiny, demi-tasse cup of espresso and they slam it down while standing at the counter. They're there for maybe 2 minutes and then they move on. And then there are other cities, really elegant, old-fashioned cities like Budapest in this picture, or Vienna or Paris, has a wonderful culture for grand cafes. And that's a place where even whether you're indoors or outdoors, it feels like it's sort of this grand community living room, this beautiful terrace. And you can sit out and linger over a cup of coffee for hours if you want to. Maybe you'll borrow a newspaper on a long wooden stick and kind of flip through the newspaper as you drink your coffee. As I mentioned, I just got back from the UK earlier this year in June. I spent about 3 weeks in Scotland. And somehow when I'm in the UK, I don't drink a lot of tea in the afternoon at lunch, at home rather. But when I'm in the UK, it sort of just feels right to have a spot of afternoon tea. It's a good way to get my caffeine and get me going, maybe with a scone and some clotted cream and jam. So the point is, each of these cultures has its own way of experimenting or getting their coffee, getting their caffeine. And I love kind of trying to analyze those and get to the bottom of them. I'm going to read now a chapter that starts off the book. And it's about my friend Alma, who you see on the right side of this picture here. There she is with her husband in a coffee shop. And she lives in the city of Mostar, Bosnia-Herzegovina. And she introduced me to the very specific Bosnian tradition of how they get their caffeine. And it's the way I've chosen to introduce my book, because I just think it's such a beautiful story and a really good example of being a temporary European. So here we are. The chapter is called Coffee and Chafe. Here in Bosnia, we have unfiltered coffee, what you Americans might call Turkish coffee, Alma said as we walked. But it's not just a drink, it's a social ritual, a way of life. We made our way through Mostar toward a cafe. The streets were cobbled with river stones, round as tennis balls and polished like marble, that threatened to turn our ankles with each step. Finally, we reached a cozy caravanserai courtyard that felt very close to the Ottoman trading outpost that Mostar once was. We settled in at a low table, and the server deliberately poured coffee into each cup. I reached for mine too eagerly. Careful, Alma said. Bosnian coffee punishes those who hurry, with a mouthful of grounds. Patiently, Alma explained the procedure and the philosophy of Bosnian coffee. There's no correct or incorrect way to drink Bosnian coffee. People spend lifetimes perfecting their own ritual. But one thing we agree on is that coffee isn't just about the caffeine. It's about relaxing, being with people you enjoy. Alma paused for effect and then took a deliberate sip. Looking deep into my eyes and smiling a relaxed smile, she continued with a rhythmic, mesmerizing cadence. Talk to your friends. Listen to what they have to say. Learn about their lives. Then take a sip. If the coffee isn't strong enough, gently swirl your cup. If it's too strong, let it wait. Just let it settle. That gives you more time to talk anyway. Looking around the courtyard, sparkling with mellow conversation and gentle laughter, Alma said, "This is a good example of merak." Merak is one of those words that you cannot directly translate into English. It means basically enjoyment. This relaxed atmosphere among friends, nursing a cup of coffee with nowhere in particular to be, savoring the simple act of passing the time of day. Taking another slow sip, Alma noted that the Bosnian language is rife with these non-translatable words, and my favorite of these is chafe. Chafe is that annoying habit you have that drives your loved ones batty, and yet it gives you pleasure. Not just pleasure, deep satisfaction. In traditional Bosnian culture, chafe is the way someone spins their worry beads, or her exacting procedure for preparing and drinking a cup of coffee, or the way he packs and smokes his pipe. Even if we don't have a word for it, chafe is universal. Maybe you have a precise coffee order that tastes just right. 12-ounce oat milk half-calf latte with 1 Splenda extra hot. Or every weekend, you feel compelled to wash and detail your car, or bake a batch of cookies, or mow your lawn in tidy diagonal rows, or prune your hedges just so. My own chafe is the way I chew gum when I'm stressed. Extra, polar ice flavor, always 2 sticks, never just 1. Americans dismiss this behavior as fussy or OCD, or simply annoying. We're expected to check our chafe at the door. But in Bosnia, they just shake their head and say, "What are you going to do?" That's his chafe. You don't have to like someone's chafe, but as long as it's not hurting anyone, you really ought to accept it, because everyone has one. Reaching the bottom of my cup, I noted that the grounds had left no residue at all. When it's done properly, Alma said triumphantly, you'll never feel grit between your teeth. If you find a layer of mud in the bottom, that means that someone, either you or the person who made the coffee, was in too much of a hurry. Setting down her mudless cup, Alma allowed the silence between us to linger for several long moments. She knew I was in a hurry to get back to work. I am always in a hurry. But she was determined to slow me down. So we waited. And we waited. I sat like a dog with a treat on my nose. My mind began to whir. Is it easier to be soulful, more at peace with idiosyncrasies when you've survived hardship? And then, as if pushing through turbulence on the way to blue skies, I felt myself calming. My pulse abated. I sensed the merak percolating around me. It's the first time that having coffee has slowed me down rather than revved me up. And finally, sensing my peace, Alma took a deep breath and spoke. Good. Shall we move on? What's next? So Alma is just one of the many fascinating Europeans that I get to introduce you to in my book. I like to say that it's a travel memoir, but to be honest, it probably fails as a memoir because I'm not even the protagonist of most of the stories. I'm just kind of the narrator, and it's my joy to be able to introduce you to all of the amazing Europeans that I get to meet in my travels. Now, the subtitle of the book is Lessons and Confessions of a Professional Traveler. So for those interested in my work with Rick Steves, I've included several behind-the-scenes, inside look chapters at different aspects of what we do there. There's a whole chapter on writing and updating guidebooks. There's a whole chapter on how to guide a tour. There's a chapter on producing public television shows. And there's a whole chapter just about what it's like to work with Rick Steves. Everyone always asks me, what's Rick Steves really like? Well, I've got the answers in this book. And I talk about working with Rick and with what we call our merry band of travelers. I'm really lucky here in Edmonds, Washington, to work with about 100 fantastic travelers. And there's a beautiful camaraderie and a beautiful spirit of travel that I talk about in that chapter of my book. Most of the time when I'm traveling, as I said earlier, I'm working on our guidebooks. And so I wanted to read to you the beginning of my chapter that's entitled A Day in the Life of a Guidebook Researcher. I've been in your hotel room. While you were out sightseeing, the receptionist let me in. I saw which guidebooks and brochures you had on the desk. I saw that you left the air conditioning on, full blast. I saw the mess, or the lack of a mess. Some of you arrange your toiletries by size next to the sink and organize your bedside reading into a neat little stack. Most of you leave the room looking like a dirty bomb exploded inside your suitcase. I'm not snooping for some sort of perverse thrill. I'm inspecting your hotel to make sure it's as we describe it in our guidebook. Is it still nicely appointed and well maintained? Is it a bit dumpy, or can it be upgraded to sharp? There's only one way to find out. I have seen thousands upon thousands of hotel rooms all across Europe. Most are freshly cleaned and ready for check-in. Quite a few I visit during that odoriferous window between checkout and cleaning, when bedclothes are strewn about, a nighttime's worth of garlic breath and stale farts mingle in the humid air, and the toilet bowl is in a state that might cause a veteran housekeeper to retire on the spot. And some rooms are currently occupied, but the occupants have stepped out. I respect a hotelier who says, sorry, we can't show you a guest's room. But if I'm being honest, I get a kick out of the ones who just don't care. They walk down the hall, lightly knocking and then throwing open each door. And sometimes, while I'm judging someone's choice of toothpaste or deodorant, or marveling at how many surfaces upon which travelers can drape wet laundry to dry, or appreciating how Germans all seem to fold their pajamas neatly on the pillow, surely this must be taught in schools, I think about how surreal it is to write a guidebook, and also how much less glamorous it is than everybody thinks. And then from there, I go on to describe exactly what goes into writing and updating our guidebooks. And as I said, I just spent 50 days on my most recent trip, but I've already spent nearly 90 days already this year in Europe updating our guidebooks. And it's a very challenging, tedious task. It's fascinating, but it's also a lot more mundane than it might seem at first blush. So I hope that chapter gives people some insight into all the work that goes into producing our guidebooks. Now, the majority of my book is not about my work as a guidebook writer. It's actually about all of the things that happen in between those stories of doing work. It's sort of the beautiful little moments that I get to enjoy sort of in the course of my travels that don't make it into the guidebook. So for a few examples, actually, Matthew, if you don't mind putting the slides up again, I'm going to skip through to here. A few examples of some of the vivid experiences that I get to share in my book. I have a whole chapter about the time that I was hiking alone with the cows high above the Swiss Alps. And it's really fun to do this because you come across little traditional cheese-making operations at these high mountain Alps. And you start to think about the fact that today, modern Swiss taxpayers are subsidizing this traditional cheese-making operation. And it really shows sort of how the Swiss people, while it's a very modern country, also really prizes tradition. I have a whole chapter about touring the street markets of Palermo in Sicily and sampling a variety of really unusual foods, starting with arancini, with the deep fried rice balls, which are not that unusual, going all the way to the famous spleen sandwich that's very popular in Palermo. And with each item traveling around the markets of Sicily, you realize that you can learn a lot about the history and the climate and the culture and the traditions and a lot of other aspects of Sicilian life by just sampling some street foods. I have a whole chapter too, just about enjoying the beautiful thermal baths of Budapest and thinking about why this is one of my favorite big cities in Europe. One of my favorite stories, though, takes place in Scotland, and I'm going to read you a slightly condensed version of that chapter here in a moment. And I think the thing I wanted to mention about Scotland and about this story in particular is that another theme of my book is that I have kind of a complicated relationship with travel cliches. As a travel writer, I really try to think deeply about, I know that travelers want to see cliches when they go to a place like Scotland. They want to go to kilts and bagpipes. But I think we want to have a sort of a deeper appreciation for travel. So when we work on our guidebooks, we don't want to just kind of give people sort of an artificial version of this, but we want to try to help them understand the history and the traditions behind these cultural cliches. And I think Scotland is a particularly challenging place to do that because it just has so many cliches associated with it. So when I talk about this in the book, by the way, there's a whole section called Deconstructing Cliches. And Scotland is one of the places where I talk about what travelers kind of are looking for and expect when they approach a place, and how I try to meet those expectations and sometimes subvert those expectations as I cover the place in the guidebook. So this is a story about when I was spending a month in Scotland several years ago, working on a new Scotland guidebook. And I was really determined to get to the bottom of some of these Scottish cliches. So I'm going to read to you the chapter called The Soggy, Sunny Highland Games of Tainault. Traveling in Scotland, you're awash in cliches. Kilts and tartans, bagpipes, whiskey, golf, haggis, lochs and castles, midges and hairy coos. Few little countries carry so much cultural baggage or leverage it so deftly for financial gain. Many tourists are exposed only to tacky tart and tat. And by the way, this is what Scottish people call the sort of the tacky cliches of Scotland, tart and tat. But my mission on this guidebook writing assignment is to deconstruct all those cliches and, if I can, uncover something deeper, something truer. And Tainault, a no-name burg, a 30-minute drive from nowhere in particular, might be my best chance to determine if there's any there. I'm in Tainault for the town's annual Highland Games. And even though it's July, frigid gusts swirl misty waterspouts across the neon green playing field. I park my car, bundle up, and feel my feet squish through the wet sponge of a lawn, with each step wringing out peaty brown water that threatens to crest the tops of my shoes. I'm considering bailing out and returning to the warmth of my B&B lounge. But then a delightful scene unfolds before me. Rural Scotland is putting on its show, rain or shine. A loudspeaker crackles to life, and a lovely, lilting Scottish voice cuts through the fog. If you'd like to join the pipe band and their parade through the village, you can follow them on up to the Tainault Hotel in a few minutes. She proceeds to list off the day's events. And she explains the rain plan. There is none. A few minutes later, ponchoed pipers and drummers fill the drizzly air with drone, wine, peal, and rat-a-tat-tat. They're trailed by villagers and a handful of visitors like me, scurrying around them to snap photos. By the time we arrive back at the playing field, the worst of the rain has passed, and, like ginger-haired earthworms, more villagers have emerged. In the center of the field, 8 brawny athletes assemble for the feats of Highland strength. They're all wearing kilts with track pants underneath and hoodies over top. The events are all variations on the same concept, hurling objects of awkward shape and size as far as possible. Things kick off with the weight throw, where the stocky strongmen spin like ballerinas before releasing a 28 or 56-pound ball on a chain into the sky. In the weight over the bar event, the Highlanders swing a 56-pound weight over an incrementally higher horizontal bar, starting at 10 feet, eventually reaching 12 feet. As our MC keeps reminding us, that's like tossing a 5-year-old child over a double-decker bus. Meanwhile, the track events are running circles around the musclemen, the 100-yard dash, the 1,500 meters, and so on. Trying to fabricate an exciting narrative out of the paltry turnout for the women's 400-meter, our MC tells us, currently there are only 2 runners in this race. They are sisters, and they are competitors. At long last, the sun emerges. People shed their waterproofs and bask in the hard-earned rays. The Highland dancers have escaped from the village hall to perform on a covered stage at the end of the field. The youngest lassies, with less control over their swinging limbs, work hard, but they lack grace. The older dancers are nimble and dignified. At one point, crossed swords are placed on a stage for the performers to delicately dance over, hopping benignly over the glinting blades. As an indication that the feats of strength may be more my cup of tea, I keep waiting for the dancers to pick up the swords and start fencing. They never do. I tease. There are reasons, historical, cultural, superstitious, why Highlanders dance over weapons, and why they do all of the things that I'm observing today. Hopping over crossblades originated as an intimidating war dance, illustrating dexterity and endurance. And those feats of strength, of course, exude power and defiance, an essential stance when you're a hard-scrabble small community, surrounded by rival communities at the northern reaches of a realm that occasionally flexes its expansionist muscles. Bagpipes occur in many cultures, but nowhere are they as closely associated with one place as in Scotland. The Highlanders used them to motivate the troops on the battlefield. After Culloden, the pivotal 1746 battle that devastated the Scottish clan system, They were outlawed as an instrument of warfare. To a Scot, bagpipes remain deeply patriotic. Those tartans, too, that epitome of Scottish cliché, have authentic origins. Members of a clan lived in the same area with access to the same natural dyes, so they dressed in similar colors. It wasn't until the Victorian age that these patterns were standardized, brightened, and neatly categorized clan by clan. Their continued embrace by modern Scots demonstrates a determination to preserve that connection to a distant past. And that speaks as well to why so many have turned out in this damp field to remind themselves of those traditions. For the Scots all around me, these touristy cliches remain a point of genuine pride. I grew up in the town of Delaware, Ohio, about a 30-minute drive north of Columbus. We're not known for much. The birthplace of Rutherford B. Hayes, widely acclaimed as one of America's most forgettable presidents, was torn down long ago, replaced by a plaque in front of a gas station. We are, however, the home of the Little Brown Jug, one of the Triple Crown events of harness horse racing. Every September, everyone gets the day off school, and the fairgrounds at the north end of town are enlivened by carnival rides, junk food, and 4-H competitions. And to kick things off, a horse parade winds through the city streets, followed close behind by a squad of pooper scoopers carrying snow shovels, who get bigger cheers than the equine grand marshals. All of this is to say, I know authentic, genuine, small-town folksiness when I see it, and I love the hell out of it. And it's clear to me that the Tainault Games are as real as they come. In the least likely place, the Scottish Highlands, inundated with tartan tat, I have found that elusive unicorn, a cliche that exists only for itself. Now, all of these beautiful travel stories sound idyllic, but as we all know, travel is often anything but. You might have noticed if you have a very well-traveled friend, when they get back from their trip, they never tell you stories about how everything went perfectly. They never tell you about the day when they made all their connections and everything went smooth as silk. No, they always tell you about the day that everything went completely backwards. They want to tell you about the day that the entire itinerary fell apart and they had to scramble for solutions. I think there's something to be said about the fact that great travelers love to tell stories about when things go wrong. And in fact, I've made a point to include a lot of my favorite such stories in the book. So for example, I tell the story of the time I was in a little village of Cornelia in Italy's Cinque Terre, and I found myself caught up in a community-wide dispute between rival gelato makers, each of whom thought they had the best gelato, and I was expected to play Samson and be the arbiter of this community-wide battle. On another occasion, I was on a cruise ship in the North Sea off the Norwegian coast during a hellacious storm where the ship was going like this. Or there was just the time that I was trying to catch a taxi to go home from Rome, and I couldn't get a taxi because it was raining. All of us travelers have these stories, and I include them in the book partly for entertainment value, but I also include them because I think there's an important lesson to be learned by sharing these stories of good trips gone bad. And that is, when things go bad, it's important to grit your teeth and remind yourself of my travel motto, which is jams are fun. I borrowed this jams are fun motto from my wife's great Aunt Mildred, and I'd like to read to you the introduction to my chapter about jams are fun and introduce you to Mildred, who is actually a pretty important presence throughout my book. So here's the story about jams are fun. On the express train from Warsaw to Krakow, I shared a compartment with 2 middle-aged American couples. They were weary and flustered, having rushed to get on the train just before it pulled out. As they settled in, I remarked how light they were packing. Each one had only one small day bag. "Oh, we use the luggage check service," they said. The luggage check service? I had never heard of such a thing. Either I was about to get a great tip for my guidebook, or they had made a terrible mistake. Yeah, you know, that desk where you give them your bags and you tell them which train you're taking, and they deliver them to you at the other end. My heart sank. They looked so exhausted, yet happy. They had dived into Poland head first and were making a go of it. And we were just a few minutes into a nonstop 3-hour train ride. But they deserved to know. Gently as I could, I explained that the service they had availed themselves of was a left luggage desk. When they got to Krakow, their bags would be waiting for them back in Warsaw. They took the news admirably and spent the rest of the trip debating who would be heading back to Warsaw that evening. While that was a very long day for one of them, I like to imagine that this has become one of their favorite travel tales, told with relish anytime someone broaches the topic of good trips gone bad. In other words, it was a classic example of my travel motto: jams are fun. My wife's great-great Aunt Mildred was a remarkable soul. At around age 60, when most of her peers were gardening and singing in the church choir, Mildred Scott began traveling. Back in the 1950s, such a thing was unheard of for an unmarried woman. No matter. Over the next 15 years, Mildred spent month after month on the road, visiting every continent on Earth. And in her final years, after seeing more of our planet than everyone else in her Ohio hometown combined, she penned a travelogue. The title, Jams Are Fun. After all those adventures, what stuck with Mildred wasn't the castles and the cathedrals, it wasn't the museums and the monuments, it wasn't the grand spectacles or the gourmet meals. It was those times when she paused to reflect on where she was without an agenda. It was the people she crossed paths with, both locals and fellow travelers, who made an impression. And most of all, it was those moments when trips went sideways. Memorable snags in perfectly laid plans that forced her to scramble for creative solutions or simply accept whatever life presented her with. For those of you who've read my book, you'll probably get a kick out of the fact that I have here in my hands a copy of Mildred Scott's Jams Are Fun, a very, very rare copy. Only a few of these exist. And when my father-in-law heard that I was writing a travel book, he said, "I think it's about time you read Mildred's book." So he mailed this to me from Ohio to Seattle. And as I was writing The Temporary European, I sat on the couch reading this book, and my wife can tell you, I was just laughing my head off. Mildred's wonderful spirit, her traveler spirit, her spunk, her sense of humor, her crankiness, her joy, her love of travel just come through so strongly in this book. And so I took some of my favorite quotes from this book, which I've peppered throughout my book, and I've kind of made Mildred sort of the spiritual guide of The Temporary European. And several of the chapters and sections of my book start off with quotes from Mildred. So before we go on, I want to read a few of my favorite Mildred quotes, which you'll also find in my book. Here's the first one. Usually, none of my friends want to go to the same place at the same time I do, so I strike out alone. But I tell people I am not alone after a taxi driver comes to my door and takes me to the airport in Columbus, Ohio, until a taxi driver brings me back to my door. Interesting people are found all over the world. I love that quote. In fact, I used it as the epigraph for my book. Here's another one. For some reason, we Yankees seem to look different from the Europeans, and they spot us. This next one, I think, is actually still really good advice, even if we don't use handkerchiefs anymore. My botany professor in college was arranging a field trip to the West for summer. He said, to go along, you'll have to be the kind of person who, if you don't have a clean handkerchief, you can use your dirty one. And finally, with all the news of airport chaos and unreliable airlines, I really love this quote from Mildred, which happened after yet another problem she had with an airline that she kind of complains about throughout the book. Here's what she says. I should have known better because I have been lied to in the offices of that airline all over the world. This was the second time that airline had dumped me out in the middle of the night in the middle of Africa. One thing I love about Mildred is I think she just captures the universality of travel. Her life story and my life story and our perspectives are completely different. But it's really striking to me as I was reading her book, how many times something she wrote really resonated with me. I think there's something really universal and kind of unifying about travel for people who love to travel. So in conclusion, and by the way, I'm going to wrap up in the next few minutes, but we do have opportunity to answer questions. So while I'm wrapping things up, if you wanted to add a question in the comments, I'll definitely stick around and answer any questions you might have about the book or about travel in general. But I just want to say, by way of conclusion, it's strange to me to think that my book, The Temporary European, which is really a love letter to traveling, basically came about because of a global pandemic. But the fact is, if it weren't for COVID-19, I don't think I ever would have taken the time to go back through all my stories and think about my travels and to tie them all together in this way. In fact, by 2019, I was extremely burned out. And in fact, in the epilogue of the book, I tell the story of the last day that I spent in Europe before the pandemic, which was in October of 2019. I had a layover in London, so I added an overnight layover. So I added a second night because I wanted to have a full, unscheduled, unstructured day to enjoy London. And I completely wasted it because I tried to do way too much, and I didn't take the time to enjoy any of it. I came home from that trip, and just a few months later, the pandemic hit, and I was locked down, unable to travel. something that I had become used to. Again, 100 days a year. It was part of my life, something I had frankly started to take for granted, and I wasn't able to do it anymore. And I spent those 2 years of not traveling regretting that day that I wasted in London. And I talk about that in the book, the lessons that I learned from that. And while I was writing the book, and just in general, I think for all of us who couldn't travel, I got to thinking about why I travel. What is it that gets under my skin about traveling? And how do I want to travel and travel better when I was able to again? And one thing that occurred to me was when I couldn't travel, I didn't care one bit about museums, castles, churches, cathedrals. I didn't miss any of those things. When we plan an itinerary to Europe, we make a list of the sites that we want to see. But in fact, when I couldn't travel, I don't think there was a single time that I said to myself, I can't wait to get back to Europe to go to that museum again. No, the things that I missed were those beautiful, quiet moments in between the sites, the beautiful moments that took place in between the stops on my itinerary. Those were the things that really got under my skin. Those are the stories that I tell in this book. And those are the things I couldn't wait to get back to. And so in thinking about this book, again, I wrote it during the pandemic while we were still locked down. I included this advice in the epilogue based on my own experiences that I hope will inspire you if and when you're able to get back to Europe again. And here's what I say. I've devoted my career to guidebooks. I believe in them and I use them anywhere that I go. But when I design one, I do not want it to be indispensable. I want it to get you to the point where you can put it away and enjoy yourself. The best travel tip, now more than ever, is this. Slow down. Sit on a bench. Take a breath. Listen to the birds chirping and the waves lapping the shore and the hubbub of a life you'll never live except for right now, except for in this moment. Notice details you've always missed. Forget about where you're going next. Focus on where you are now. Believe me, with my endless to-do lists, there's nobody who has a harder task of this than I do. But somehow, not always, but just enough, I manage. And I'll redouble my efforts when I hit the road again. I'm happy to say I have hit the road again. As I mentioned earlier, I've already spent close to 90 days on the road in Europe so far this year. And it's been just wonderful to be back. And Matthew, if you don't mind putting the last batch of slides up, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the ways that I've tried to live this advice since I've been back. I took off we hadn't updated our guidebooks in 2 years. And so I took off in February and I first went to London and then I went to Rome on a mission to update all of these Rick Steves guidebooks that had kind of gone fallow for 2 years. So I landed in London and I spent about 12 days updating our 600-page London guidebook. And then I flew straight to Rome and I spent about 10 days updating our 600-page Rome guidebook. By the way, the first of those books, London and Rome, are coming out, I think, later this month. So these new editions are on the way for the sort of the post-COVID. I know we're still in the midst of COVID, but it's the first time we've updated the books grappling with the reality of COVID. And as you can imagine, it's a tremendous amount of work to update these guidebooks. And I would have every excuse. If you've read my book, you know I had big talk about how I was going to do things differently when I got back to travel. But with all the work I have to do, I have every excuse in the world not to do it. I have every excuse in the world just to get back to work and become jaded and burned out again. But I will say, I really held myself to my pledge so far in my travels this year. And I'm determined to continue to hold myself to that pledge when I head back to Europe about a month from now. So, for example, when I was in London, I went to basically every major museum in the entire city, and I had a day off. And I thought, I'd like to go out to the little village of Richmond, which is out on the edge of London. Now, I'll admit, I wanted to go to Richmond mainly because that's where they filmed Ted Lasso. So I went out to Richmond, and I was able to see Ted Lasso's pub, and I was able to see Ted Lasso's apartment. But after I saw those things, I realized Richmond also has this beautiful village green. And so I just sat out there on a sunny Sunday afternoon in February, watching dogs chasing tennis balls for 30 minutes. And I got to say, it was one of my favorite travel experiences, probably my single favorite travel experience during those 2 weeks in London. Later on this year in May, I was in Poland. I was actually back to tour guiding. I was leading our brand new Best of Poland in 10 Days tour. We happened to be in Warsaw on a very special day. Now, in Warsaw, there's a big park called Łazienki Park, and there's a gigantic statue of Friedrich Chopin, favorite son of Warsaw and of Poland, Friedrich Chopin, in the middle of the park. And they have this beautiful tradition in Warsaw. Every summer on Sundays, they do outdoor music concerts around this statue of Chopin. They had not been able to do these concerts since 2019 because of the pandemic. And I happened to be there on the first day that they were back doing these concerts. And I just can't tell you how beautiful that experience was. sitting on a lawn in this big park surrounded by thousands of people of Warsaw who were just paying complete attention to this beautiful music concert, reconnecting with this important tradition for their city. I didn't see any other tourists there except for the tour members that I brought along with me. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful moment, far away from any of the sites or the museums. Lots of other examples of this. I was in Amsterdam just a couple weeks after I was in Poland, and I had a lazy Saturday morning. So I said, rather than go get brunch at a restaurant, I'm going to go to one of the street markets of Amsterdam and just basically graze my way to a progressive brunch, just sort of stopping off at the different stands and trying whatever looked good to me. My favorite thing, by the way, in the Netherlands is they have these poffertjes, which are these little tiny puffy pancakes, and they sprinkle them with powdered sugar and they drizzle them with stroop, which is Dutch syrup, and they stick a little Dutch flag in it. And man, that was one of my favorite breakfasts or brunches that I think I've had in years. And it was just wandering out the door of my Airbnb and exploring a market in Amsterdam. And then after that, I rented a bike and I went for a pedal through Vondelpark, which is this big, beautiful park in Amsterdam, and just had a glorious day there as well. One more example, I was in Edinburgh. This was just the beginning of June, a couple months ago. And I had a lot to do to update that book, but it was Friday afternoon, about 6 o'clock. All the museums were closed. And I kept hearing about this beautiful village called Dean, which is really just a short walk from the downtown center of Edinburgh. And running through the village of Dean is the Water of Leith, which is this beautiful river that leads all the way out to the old historic port of Edinburgh. And my work was done for the day. So I said, you know what, busy as I am, I'm going to take a couple hours and walk a few miles along the Water of Leith walkway. And it's just listening to the river gurgle and feeling very far away from Edinburgh, even though I was just a short bus trip from the very center of the city. These are just a few of the examples of how in my recent travels, I've been successful at holding to my pledge and really trying to slow down and appreciate being in Europe and not get so caught up in my to-do list and in my wish list that I forget where I am. One way that I try to do this, by the way, you can borrow this if you want, is if I hear a church bell ring, I use that as kind of a meditation chime. It sort of reminds me to stop. I literally physically stop what I'm doing in Europe if I hear a church bell. And I don't necessarily listen to the church bell, but I use it as a reminder to look around and pay attention to where I am and to really make a point to be present and notice little details and all these things that I just talked about. And I find that's a really good strategy for keeping yourself present, even when you're busy and distracted and jet lagged and tired and cranky. You can still be a temporary European, have those moments. Well, thank you very much for listening to me tonight. I hope if you haven't already made it back to Europe, you will again soon. It's wonderful to be back. And when you do go back to Europe, I hope that my book reminds you to stop and listen to the church bells. I hope it teaches you that jams are fun. And I hope it inspires you to travel as a temporary European. Thank you very much for joining me. And I think we've got some time now for some questions. So
yes,
Matthew, have at it.
Great. So the one thing that I wanted to bring up first, it's harkening back to what we talked about prior to the stream. We did get one about Nessie. So surely from Andrea Trupp, you'll surely be adding Nessie Gate to your next book. Might I ask for some context?
Yeah, for those who haven't heard about this, I warned Matthew. I bet someone will ask about Loch Ness. So part of the reason I chose to read the story about Scottish Highland Games is because I was just in Scotland, and I'll make a long story short, but I was traveling around. I had 3 weeks with a car. I had a wonderful time. I loved everything that I did in Scotland, with one exception. I was driving by Loch Ness one day, and I just got so depressed at what a tourist trap it was, because if you drive along the main highway, specifically out of Inverness going towards the Isle of Skye, you just go past some of the worst tourist traps in all of the UK. And it's just this kind of really tacky, it's all about the Loch Ness monster. And it just put me in a really foul mood. The only thing I didn't like in Scotland. So I put a post on my Facebook page, basically about how much I hate the Loch Ness monster. And, it got a fun response from fellow travelers that I sort of framed it like basically saying, if you're a traveler and you're going to Scotland, you think you want to go to Loch Ness, but really think twice about that. And I listed several other examples of things that are nearby that I think are far more culturally broadening and far more insightful about Scotland than Loch Ness. And it went over pretty well at first. And then a few days later, I started my Facebook book started getting all these negative comments, and I realized the Scottish tabloids had picked it up. First, a Glasgow Sun tabloid had a story. The headline was, "American travel writer defames Loch Ness and says that Nessie does not exist." And then it got picked up by 4 or 5 other tabloids. And there was, I have screenshots of them. There was like 6 or 7 articles. I was basically the victim of a 24-hour British tabloid news cycle. And the BBC Scotland actually contacted me to ask if I wanted to go on and talk about it. And I didn't, because what I realized was the post was originally for American and Canadian travelers, trying to give them advice. And it got picked up by Scottish people who took personal offense at it, which in retrospect, I understand. They were never the intended audience. And actually, I had a few really nasty comments on my Facebook page, or there's a whole video online of like man on the street interviews in Inverness, where they just stopped about 10 people and said, "What do you think of Cameron's thoughts on Loch Ness?" And every single one is a Scottish person saying, "I think he's an idiot. I think he needs to have his eyes checked. He's a moron." So that's really good for if your ego's getting too big, you should defame Nessie in Scotland. But I will say, I really I felt bad that I'd hurt people's feelings. And actually had a really thoughtful guy who was a tour guide at Loch Ness who wrote and said, you could have, seen other parts of Loch Ness and not just focused on that tourist trap stuff. And I had to agree with him. I mean, I actually kind of had a good conversation with him about it. But, I really stand by it. And after the fact, what I stand by is, I think it's why I got so mad to begin with. It's interesting. When I looked back and sort of psychoanalyzed myself and I said, why did that set me off? I just spent 45 minutes talking about how I spent 2 years thinking about how to be a better traveler and what good travel was about. And I think and I was finding that everywhere I went in Scotland. And then I came into Loch Ness and I just felt like this is the opposite of good travel. And it just made me furious. Something snapped. I mean, it triggered me. It was like, is this what we waited 2 years for? To go buy a stuffed fake monster in a gift shop? This is not good travel. And so in retrospect, I think that's why it really got under my skin, because I just don't have patience for the tourist traps anymore. I've never been particularly fond of them, but I just feel like COVID taught us how precious travel is. It taught us that travel is a privilege. And I feel like a sort of a crass tourist trap like Loch Ness and the Loch Ness Monster just sort of violates that privilege in a way. And so I think that's what got me so upset about it. So I was able to laugh about it, but there were a few moments where I felt like all of Scotland was furious at me. So that's the story of
you were not a believer then.
Yeah, no. Well, part of what I said was, and if you go there anyway, I don't want to get into it, but it's so obvious. Well, here's the other thing. It's so obvious that it's just fake. There's no evidence. It's a complete hoax. It's purely for baiting tourists. And the thing that really bothered me about it is, read the story about Scotland. There's so many things in Scotland that are cliches, but they also really are rooted. They tell you something real about Scotland if you know what to look for. And I think the thing that makes me crazy about Loch Ness Monster is it doesn't have anything to say about Scotland. It's just tacky. It's fake. It's tacky. There's nothing about the Loch Ness Monster that actually gives you any real insights into Scotland. And I think that's where I draw the line. So that's the story of Nessie Gate.
Well, thank you very much for that context.
Sure.
So from Pete, we have, my wife and I are looking to visit Europe this winter, but we aren't sure where to go. I know holiday markets and the like are popular, and was wondering where you would suggest to go for a good winter trip.
So in the winter, if you want holiday market, that is why most people go in the winter. And I think Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Czech Republic are all places that are really known to have excellent holiday markets. I've heard Zagreb in Croatia has a surprisingly good one. I think anything in kind of in that sort of Germanic part of Central Europe is particularly good for holiday markets. So I would say look around. The most famous is Nuremberg, but there's many, many choices. So I would say there's lots of resources out there for learning more about holiday markets. The other thing I would suggest, that's for holiday markets. If you want to go to Europe off season, people sometimes ask, where should I go? Places that are like Sicily, that are a little warmer weather. They're not tropical, so it's not like you're going to be swimming in the ocean and sitting on a beach. But some of the parts of Italy or Sicily or Greece can have pretty mild winters, and that could be a really nice place to go in the winter. My whole family, my wife's whole family and I went to our favorite little corner of Tuscany over Thanksgiving week several years ago. It's an agriturismo who has enough American guests that she understands that Thanksgiving is a thing for Americans. So she created a program that was traditional Tuscan culture, but kind of tied to American Thanksgiving. We even had a Thanksgiving dinner that was amazing because it was a brilliant Tuscan chef who tried to adapt American Thanksgiving dishes to the Tuscan style, So that's what the whole thing was. It was this great hybrid of American and Tuscan culture. And what I'd say about that is this was in Tuscany, which isn't even southerly. It's not even that warm. And it was great to be there in late November, early December. So I'd say either holiday markets or somewhere that's got kind of a nice mild climate.
Coincidentally, the next question from Marianne is leaving for Tuscany in September. I bought Hill Towns in Central Italy, 6th edition. Is there any more recent info on Tuscany available?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're updating all of our books right now. We have not updated our books in person since before the pandemic, but we have a whole team of researchers. I am far from the only one doing this. Rick Steves researchers who are currently updating our books. In a normal year, we take about 350 days of work to update our guidebooks. I mean, work in Europe. This year, we've got like 500 days of work scheduled in Europe. We're working overtime to get the books out as fast as possible. This is actually just good information for anyone who's interested in travel books. Our best-selling titles will all be available. The new editions, the new post-COVID, again, I say post-COVID, not that COVID's over, but that it's updated during the age of COVID. The first of those are coming in a couple of weeks. And by Christmas, all of our best-selling titles will be updated and available. And then through 2023, every week or two, we're going to kind of start with our bestsellers and then work our way down the list so that we're just going to have this constant churn of new editions coming out. For the Italy material, that's very popular material. So September for Tuscany might be a little too soon. I don't remember the exact schedule. But the Italy books are going to start to appear in the new editions in the coming weeks. I will say, if you go on the Rick Steves website and into our guidebook section, you can actually see when the new edition is available for each title. I don't know if you're able to look that up at Majors and Quinn as well, Matthew.
We can certainly research it for you here in store, but we can look at the website as well.
Yeah, to know when the next edition's coming. So they are coming. It just takes a long time to do it, and we're doing it at super express pace right now.
Right. So from Ben, do you have any advice for publishing a travel memoir?
That's a good question. I think it's an interesting, what I learned pretty quickly when I went to publish this book is there's not a huge market for travel memoirs. I think I'm kind of old fashioned. I used to love reading Bill Bryson when he was doing, I still love Bill Bryson, but I used to love his travel books in the 90s when I was in college and whatnot. And I kind of had this illusion that there's a big market for travel memoirs. But what I learned was there's a very, very slim market for travel memoirs. And I think publishers, a lot of them just don't think it's worth it because they're not going to make enough money, because ultimately publishing is a business. So I was extremely fortunate to get connected with Traveler's Tales based in the Bay Area. That's who published The Temporary European. In my case, it was a great fit because they like to travel. They want to publish exactly the kind of stuff I was writing, which is kind of literary travel writing, thoughtful travel writing. It's not a guidebook. That's a whole other market. We have a whole other publisher for that, but this was a good fit for me. But I will say, just be realistic that there's not a huge market for it. A lot of people end up doing self-publishing if they can't get their foot in the door at a traditional publisher. And that's increasingly viable. I have a good friend who's actually working on right now doing a self-publishing thing. So yeah, but it's interesting. I wish literary travel writing and travel memoirs were a bigger market sector, but at the end of the day, I learned the hard way that they're just not. It's kind of sad because that's what I like to read.
So we have another one from Francis. Hope to read your book soon. Love about the church bells. When you research for guidebooks, do you move between cities by car or by public transit?
Yep, good question. It depends on the itinerary. So on this trip in Scotland, I was on foot in Edinburgh. And then when I left Edinburgh, I got a car because I was going to a lot of smaller towns and villages, and I stopped at a lot of countryside places. In Scotland, we happen to have a lot of sites and museums and restaurants and hotels that are in the middle of nowhere. So I had to have a car to connect them. Earlier in the trip, I was in the Netherlands, and I had a week, and I did it all by train. I went to actually 5 towns in 5 days. It worked out perfectly. So I did Haarlem on Monday, Leiden on Tuesday, Delft on Wednesday, The Hague on Thursday, and Rotterdam on Friday. And if you know the Netherlands, those cities are all connected by a train line, and they're each 15 minutes apart. So I was able to do all that just by train without ever having to get in a car. So it just really depends on the specifics of the itinerary. Awesome. And I will say, we try to do what our readers are doing. So sometimes, even if we'd be more convenient to do it by car, we'll take public transportation, buses and trains, just because we need to know how it works. And we kind of want to take the hard way of doing it. You know, Rick always says we're kind of the guinea pigs for travelers. We need to actually do it to see if it works for travelers without a car. So there are cases where we'd like to have a car, but we do it by train and bus just to make sure it can be done.
Great. From Andrea, hot take here. You were not wrong. Oh, I think we lost our author. Well, to continue with that hot take, you were not wrong about that particular route. Scotland has so much more to offer. Oh, and we are back. Hello.
I'm back. Sorry, I think I dropped off for a second, but I'm back. I want to hear the question.
It wasn't a question, just a hot take. You were not wrong, particularly along that route. Scotland has so much more to offer.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
And then just an update on Florence and Tuscany update from Andrea. Again, looks like update coming October 2022.
Oh,
Thank you for doing the research.
Yeah, it's coming soon.
Great. Well, it looks like those are the last of the questions, comments, concerns. So I'll leave it to you for closing remarks.
Well, I'll just say thanks to all of you who showed up tonight. I hope you enjoyed the reading. I hope you enjoyed the book. I'm heading out again in September. I'm taking off for Switzerland around Labor Day. And then from there, I go to Croatia and Slovenia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. So you can always follow me on Facebook if you want to follow along with me, especially since the pandemic. I find I'm doing a lot more almost daily posting on Facebook. Sometimes it gets me in trouble, like in Loch Ness. But if you like to kind of see what I'm up to, you can follow me on Facebook. And yeah, I just thank you so much to Majors and Quinn for having me. And thanks to all of you for taking an interest in my book.
And thank you so much for doing this event. And thank you, everybody, for showing up tonight. I've posted, again, the link to the book on our website, and feel free to check that out. And yeah, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you again next time.
All right,
thanks.
Bye-bye.